Welcome to part 2 of the Unbridled Discussion series, To Observe Horses is to Know Horses. In part 1, I talked about how horses use synchronization and mirroring to create and express emotional connection. Today I'm going to talk about how horses perceive and use space to create and maintain healthy relationships, and to nurture a harmonious herd community. Part 3 will focus on touch and what touch really means to our horses. For those who may be joining me for the first time, I'm Kim Hallen, president of Unbridled LLC, located just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. You can learn more about me and my work at www.unbridled.guru. The information I'm going to share today has the potential to be completely transformative for you and your horse. This is because the truth always sets us free. And I believe, as Mal Pankos does, that telling someone the truth is a loving act. This is why I want to share what my horses have been teaching me. And interestingly, I was excited to learn that much of what I've been observing in my own domestic herd matches with what equine ethologist Lucy Reese has discovered while studying wild herds. I read about this just recently in her new book, Horses in Company. I've included a photo of the book cover here in case you want to look for it. I ordered my copy through Amazon. Those who have spent time working with horses know that horses are often claustrophobic in close quarters. This is why they have trouble getting on trailers a lot of the time. It's really understandable, given that the feral or wild horses live in vast open areas. As prey animals, they rely on the flight or fight response for survival. So having unobstructed views over large areas and plenty of room to run if danger arises are core requirements for low-stress living. But what about the fact that horses are also naturally very herd-bound? This is because they instinctively know that being isolated from other horses is a life-threatening situation, which makes them much more vulnerable to predators. What this means is that in addition to valuing wide open spaces, horses are also extremely sensitive to how much distance there is between themselves and the safety and comfort of their herd mates. So which is more important to horses, having space and freedom, or proximity and companionship? Of course, the answer is both, but that's still not an adequate answer to help you understand what's most important to horses when it comes to space. It's taken me many years of observing herd behavior to figure out that what's most important to horses is having a sense of control over space, and especially control over the space around their bodies and control over their proximity to and connection with other horses. What this means is that control of the space around them is a primary topic of conversation and negotiation among and between horses. In fact, from my observations of horse behavior, I'd say this is easily the topic they communicate about the most. It's also the topic they try to communicate with us the most about as well. Unfortunately, we often misinterpret these conversations as being about dominance. Here's the key thing I want you to take away from today's discussion. When we insist that our horses allow us to enter into their personal space whenever and however we want, we're actually taking away the one thing that is most valuable to them, having control over the space around their bodies. The traditional approaches we humans often take with the activities we like to do with our horses often also cause us to take away our horse's control over proximity to its herd mates. When you look at this picture of me telling my mare Tempo that I have a right to bring my energy and intention into her personal space in this moment, is that a look of trust or respect that you see in her eye? What I see is a look of disempowerment, confusion, and vulnerability. But how are we supposed to handle, manage, ride, and train our horses without violating their personal space? The bad news is we can't always avoid it entirely. But the good news is there's a way to communicate about personal space that makes much more sense and feels much more fair to our horses. And we only have to look to their living example to understand how it works. First, we have to acknowledge that to horses, space is not invisible or meaningless or empty. It is a powerful and valuable resource to be used strategically to communicate, to build trust, to develop respect, and to maintain peaceful and harmonious relationships. From my observations of horses, I've developed what I call the 3 equine tenets regarding personal space. to make it easier for me to remember what's important to my horses when I want to talk with them about this topic. Tenet number 1, know thy boundaries and how to communicate them. This photo shows my big gray thoroughbred cross, Marcus, kicking his heels up at Shoki, my little bay Arabian. It's an excellent example of tenet number 1 in action. Marcus, the gray, is at the bottom of the pecking order in my herd. Shoki is at the top. And yet this well-established ranking does not stop Marcus from letting Shoki know very clearly when he feels that Shoki has crossed the line and is disrespecting his personal space. Tenet number 1 holds true regardless of pecking order. Every horse is expected to know its own personal space boundaries and to communicate clearly about those boundaries. Tenet number 2, own it and mean it. A sidebar to this is the fact that horses never lie about their personal space boundaries. And as it turns out, neither do pigs. This fun photo shows my pig, Bartholomew, very shortly after he showed up on my farm as a wee little piglet. I wanted to include this photo because the only way Bartholomew gained the trust and respect of my herd was by being absolutely crystal clear from day one what his own personal space boundaries were, and by owning them 100%. When you are really little and the other you're trying to communicate with is really big, you absolutely have to mean it. And in the world of horses, intention, integrity, honesty, and commitment are everything. When they sense that these characteristics are being displayed authentically, without threat of physical harm, they will show respect. Tenet number 3, don't judge or micromanage the response. This is a huge one because it ensures that even the horse who is being instructed to move away or back off still has control over his or her own decisions and personal space. In this photo, you see Shoki, the bay, letting Marcus know that he needs more personal space. Shoki is 100% committed to communicating this effectively. But Shoki does not then micromanage Marcus's response beyond defining the space he needs Marcus to move out of. What Marcus does beyond that, including how much further he chooses to go, or what kind of attitude he has about it, is entirely up to Marcus. Now imagine how different all 3 of these scenarios would feel if the participants were physically restrained and did not have the freedom and liberty to react authentically or with full autonomy. For horses, having complete control over their own role in any conversation about personal space is absolutely critical. And yet this control is the very thing we often expect them to relinquish in their relationships with us. In a herd setting, every horse in every moment is expected to be crystal clear about what his or her personal space boundaries are and to communicate about those boundaries. This is a responsibility they take very seriously and practice executing all the time. Interestingly, most often it simply involves one horse choosing to quietly and undramatically adjust its position or move away if and when another horse starts to infringe on its personal space. And from my observation, it seems to matter not which horse is higher in the pecking order. All 4 of my horses are more likely to adjust their own position in relation to others in the herd than to needlessly insist that others move out of their space. So when my herd is out grazing, they mostly just float around, creating patterns and moving closer and farther away from one another throughout the day. This kind of peaceful balance and harmony is only possible because each horse takes its job of monitoring and communicating its own personal space very seriously, and because each horse knows it can always trust the others to do the same. There are times, and especially so in domestic settings where horses are not always free to behave in the ways they would in the wild, when discussions about personal space boundaries can become quite physical. And the pecking order does often play a role in how those discussions play out. But even so, once the point has been made and both parties are clear about what the renegotiated personal space boundaries are, there is no further micromanagement or judgment. Each of the altercations in the photos on the screen had a particular purpose, and as quickly as the issue was cleared up, the horses returned to business as usual, which is a state of calm and relaxation. I'm now going to show you the full details of some of the personal space discussions represented in previous photos. Here you have the full conversation between Tempo and Bartholomew. In the beginning, Bartholomew was minding his own business when Tempo approached and initiated a conversation about his personal space boundaries. You can see that in all 6 of the photos, the little pig remains 100% committed to the space he has claimed. This was one of the first times Tempo interacted directly with Bartholomew after his arrival. So you can see that she's testing to see if he understands the 3 tenets. In the first 4 photos, Tempo is asking Bartholomew if he knows his own personal space boundary and how to communicate it. Yes, ma'am, says the pig. In the 5th photo, Tempo is asking him, can you really own it and mean it? Again, Bartholomew answers, yes, ma'am. And in the 6th and final photo, Tempo is making sure that Bartholomew, who, by the way, small as he was then, is still a predator who could have been a threat to her, also respects the final tenet. Don't micromanage my response. Tempo retreated out of Bartholomew's personal space, but she did it on her own theatrical terms. By not responding to these theatrics, Bartholomew confirmed that he did indeed understand and respect the 3rd tenet. And this is how one little piglet, who is now a much bigger pig, earned his place as a trusted member of my herd. I also want to stress that Bartholomew is at the bottom of the herd pecking order, even now that he's big. So this conversation was not about establishing dominance. It was about solidifying mutually understood ground rules. In the second scenario, Marcus had been quietly napping under the run-in, but he happened to be bogarting Shoki's favorite nap spot. So you can see that when Shoki decided to approach and claim his nap spot, he's already feeling a bit grouchy. Being the highest horse in the pecking order, Shoki could easily have just chased Marcus out of the run-in altogether. But he didn't. Instead, he chose to give Marcus the chance to voluntarily move over. Marcus, who obviously was not feeling threatened by Shoki's approach, decided he wanted to see just how committed Shoki was before he moved. As Shoki arrived, he remained committed to his feelings that it was his turn to occupy that space. So he clarified his communication about his own personal space boundary. That's tenet number 1. And here's what I really want you to take in. Even though Marcus is low man in my herd's pecking order, he still felt perfectly comfortable holding Shoki accountable for tenet number 2. Own it and mean it. Observing this type of interaction between members of my herd is what has helped me to understand that the pecking order and discussions about personal space boundaries are not evidence that horses use dominance to establish or maintain relationships. This interaction between Shoki and Marcus is a two-way conversation during which both horses have equal voices, both are voluntary participants, and there are very clear ground rules or tenets that they both understand and abide by. Once Shoki demonstrated that he meant it, and he was willing to own the personal space he was claiming, Marcus quietly moved away. Shoki also honored tenet number 3. Don't micromanage or judge the response. Here you can see that once Shoki owned what he was saying about his personal space, he was not then compelled to tell Marcus exactly where he had to go or what he had to do. That would be how a bully would behave. All that mattered to Shoki was that Marcus respected his need for personal space by moving away. Marcus maintained full control over his own personal space throughout the entire exchange. He could easily have left earlier if he wanted to. And then he actually came back around to join Shoki for some additional nap time. But at that point, he was very clear how close he could get without violating Shoki's personal space boundary. With that shared clarity, they were both happy and content to nap together. So how do we put all of this information to use in our relationships with our horses? The first step is to start becoming really, really clear about when we're training our horses and when we're working on the relationship. If you aren't sure about how to know the difference, I want to make it really easy for you. Anytime we're asking our horse to operate in opposition to the 3 tenets regarding personal space, we are training. Training is, by its own definition, behavior modification. And if our desire is to alter our horse's natural way of behaving in relationships, we are modifying their behavior. Obviously, training is required in order to teach horses how to function and how to be safe in the human world. But we also need to understand that what our horses value most is being in relationships that honor their need and desire to have control over their own personal space. So if we want to strengthen the personal relationships we have with our horses, we should behave in ways that let them know we understand and honor what's important to horses in their relationships. A sidebar here is that it is possible to go back and forth between being in training mode and being in relationship building mode when we spend time with our horses. The important thing is knowing and being intentional about which mode we're in so that our horses are clear too. Being respectful of personal space is not something we humans are naturally very good at. Or maybe we just have forgotten how to be good at it. But anyway, we're certainly not good at it in comparison to horses. So one of my favorite group exercises that I do in my equine assisted learning business to help humans understand what it feels like to be part of a community where every member respects the other's personal space is something I call independence within community, or alone in our togetherness. First, we take a few minutes to simply observe the horses while they're grazing, noticing the spaces between their bodies. We acknowledge that these spaces are not empty, nor are they random. They have deep meaning and purpose within the established culture of my herd, and these spaces are being used strategically to maintain peace and harmony in every moment. Once we have a good sense of the personal space boundaries being honored amongst the horses, one by one we enter the pasture with the goal of not disrupting any of the horses, meaning our entrances don't even cause the horses to pick up their heads or look our way. We then position ourselves somewhere in the pasture where we each feel our presence supports rather than disrupts the environment of peace and calm. We become a part of the herd zen, if you will. After this exercise, I always like to ask participants how it felt to be one with the herd in this way. Common responses include, it felt peaceful. I felt centered and accepted. Everything felt really balanced. Some participants also admit that they actually felt vulnerable or worried that the horses would be disrupted by their energy. This feeling of vulnerability comes because we aren't used to thinking about how our energy affects others. But once we know, understand, and have faith in the 3 equine tenets of personal space, it allows us to feel just as safe and confident as the horses feel in this herd environment. I want to stop and take a moment now to talk about something that can get pretty controversial: the use of hand-fed treats when interacting with horses. I'm not taking a position regarding the use of treats in training, and I'm actually an experienced clicker trainer, and my horses all know how to be polite with treats. But in my personal experience, when I want to be in relationship building mode with my horses, food makes this very difficult, if not impossible, especially in regard to having authentic conversations about personal space boundaries. In the previous slide, I showed you 2 photos of workshop participants standing out in the pasture with my horses. The horses were calm and relaxed, feeling no desire to either leave or approach the humans. This type of easy, relaxed coexistence is simply not possible if the horses think the humans might have treats. Let me illustrate what I mean. In this photo, Tempo is showing me what an authentic conversation about personal space boundaries looks like. As you can see, I was approaching Tempo from behind, and up to this point in my approach, she had been watching me but remained totally calm and relaxed. When I hit the edge of her personal space boundary, she very deliberately communicated this to me, both with her tail and by taking a small step away from me. Horses speak to us through their behavior, and this is what an honest conversation looks like. Tempo is in tune with her true feelings about my approach in this moment, and she assumes that I will hear her when she expresses them. Now I'm bringing up a series of photos that illustrate how dramatically different the horses behave when food rewards are involved. These photos were taken during a recent workshop when, at lunchtime, I needed to bring Bartholomew in and put him up. Bartholomew is the pig, and he did not respond when I called him, so I went and got his favorite treat ball toy and headed his way, but I had to go through the pasture. It became obvious immediately that Bart was not the only one who noticed I had the treat ball. Look at Tempo and Puck and Shoki in the first photo. As soon as I entered the pasture, their heads popped up, and both of the mares immediately headed in my direction. Then you can see Puck not only trotting in my direction, but intentionally trying to cut Bart out of the conversation. Tempo is right behind her, and the 2 mares continue to beeline toward me. Not walking, mind you, but trotting. Now, I could pretend that these 2 horses are just really happy to see me and to interact with me, but the simple truth is this: their seeking drive got engaged when they sensed that food was involved, and all they're doing here is making sure they get to the treats before anyone else does. The next photos in this series show how Tempo and Puck override their own natural personal space boundaries, both in regard to their proximity to one another and to me, and how they also disregard my personal space boundaries as well as those of Bartholomew. The mares have been conditioned in the past to believe that the way to earn treat rewards is to engage with humans. And while this modified behavior can be very useful for training purposes, it completely disrupts any natural conversations about personal space and can create a false impression about what's important in a larger context to our horses. Now, my mares are not being impolite in their quest for the treats here. They're not mugging me, they're not trampling me, and if I had cued them to back out of my space, they would have done so quite enthusiastically because they've been trained to do that. But cueing them to back up in order to earn a reward is very different than honest two-way communication about personal space boundaries. In the final photo at the bottom right, you can see how the heightened emotions around food also cause the horses, including Shoki now, to behave dominantly toward Bartholomew. This behavior is in direct opposition to how my animals behave when they are all out grazing together. It's the high-value food rewards, not grass when they're grazing, but those food rewards that are known to be limited in availability, meaning it's something that doesn't exist in nature the way it does in domestic life for horses. This is what triggers this kind of dominance behavior. When out grazing together, all the animals make honoring one another's personal space boundaries priority number one. But clearly, that's not the case when a limited supply of high-value food rewards are involved. So when it comes to interacting with our horses, I've learned that when I'm in relationship building mode, it behooves me to create an environment where my horses feel relaxed and confident enough to communicate honestly with me about their personal space boundaries. I also want them to be able to listen when I communicate honestly about mine too. Horses feel most at ease when they know that both individuals in a relationship understand tenet number one and can embody it honestly. For this reason, I've made a personal choice to no longer feed my horses treats by hand, and I don't let others feed my horses treats either. In my experience and in the work I do with my equine-assisted learning business, the gift of honest communication is far more valuable and rewarding. Now, I want to go over some key indicators that horses commonly use to communicate with us about their personal space. A horse that feels its personal space is being violated will often raise its head. It might also swish its tail or pin its ears. Some horses are much more vocal with their body language, while others may offer only subtle signs, such as quietly shifting their weight and or turning their head or their body away as we approach. If we ignore these signs and continue pushing into their space uninvited, most horses will choose to leave, thus creating more space for themselves. A special note here. There are some horses that will turn aggressive and try to defend their space versus leaving. In most cases, these are horses who have experienced at some point in their lives situations where leaving was not an option for them or that option had been taken away from them. So if you have a horse with aggressive tendencies in response to personal space conversations, I'd love for you to reach out to me privately. I have a fair amount of experience dealing with this kind of aggression, and I'd love to help. So, we also need to think about what indicators we use to communicate with our horses about our personal space boundaries. There are many ways to do this. For me, when I see a horse approaching, I try to assess the energy and intention I feel coming from that horse well before it arrives in my personal space. If the approach is slow and polite, I may use a very subtle indicator, such as gently reaching my hand out to meet the horse and invite it to stop and sniff a greeting. Or if I choose to let the horse into my personal space, I might allow him to come all the way up to me. However, if the horse's approach feels strong or pushy, or if it is coupled with agitated or overeager energy, I will intentionally lift my posture and own my space. If the horse doesn't respond accordingly, I will then lift my hands and not so much with movement, but energetically block the horse's approach. I can use movement to back it up if I need to, but I find that horses are very responsive to this centered energy and most understand it intrinsically, even without any training. In order to have balanced respect in the relationships with our horses, we not only need to learn how to read their body language, but we need to also practice knowing and communicating our own personal space boundaries. This may sound easy, but it's really not at first. Most humans rarely even think about communicating our personal space boundaries until those boundaries have actually been violated, and we find ourselves feeling unsafe, sometimes with a horse right on top of us. It takes practice and presence to notice when we get that first inkling that our horse is trying to ask a question about our personal space boundary. And it takes clarity to let them know when they shouldn't come any closer without permission. From watching my horses in their herd environment, I have come to realize that the highest level of trust, respect, and friendship is demonstrated in the most unassuming ways. When horses simply share space together peacefully, with one another, with us, or with other animals. If you are interested in learning more about how to communicate at this level with your own horse, I hold public workshops monthly at my farm in South Carolina, and I also offer in-person and virtual coaching services. In the months ahead, I will be launching an online classroom where I plan to publish more videos like these so that subscribers can access them anytime from anywhere. In the meantime, don't forget to check out the final episode of this series, which will be about how horses use and perceive touch. This topic will get you seeing and thinking in new ways all over again. Thanks for joining me today, and as always, have a great day, and may the horse be with you.